Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. Today, I'm going to look back on all of the books that I've read this year. So 2024 was a pretty amazing reading year for me. I've read some incredible books. I've read 56 books in all. The vast majority of these being sci-fi, of course. But I did also read a few books outside the genre. And I'm going to talk about all of these books here. I'm going to present them in the order in which I read them, and I'm going to tier rank them. So we'll have quite an interesting list at the end of it, and we can find out what my top reads were this year. So let's dive in, and we're off to a very strong start because the first book I read this year was Michael Bishop's No Enemy But Time, which is a time travel novel, incredibly well written, with a very fascinating premise. So we have a story in which a man gets sent back in time, millions of years, to the ancient African savannah as part of a grand anthropological experiment, and in which he comes into contact with ancient hominids. So it's an interesting premise, but it's also very beautifully written. I think Michael Bishop is an incredibly eloquent writer. He's also very witty, and he has a great ability to create complex and believable and interesting characters. All of these ingredients come together to create an excellent time travel adventure, and I'm going to give it 5 stars. Fearless by Alan Stroud was also an excellent read. This is a high-stakes, action-packed, thrilling, near-future space opera. And it's narrated in a very intriguing way. We've got a rotating cast of point-of-view characters, and the action feels like it takes place in real time throughout the whole novel. It's very intense, and it kind of feels a bit like watching an episode of 24 in space. So I really enjoyed this, and I found this storytelling approach quite novel and fresh. And so I think this is also deserving of 5 stars. In fact, I'm going to put it just after No Enemy But Time. Although at the time I reviewed this on this channel, I think I only give it 4 stars. I think my main issue with this book at the time was that it ends very abruptly. So it doesn't have a very satisfying ending. But I don't think of that as an issue anymore, because once you go on to the sequel, it all comes together very neatly. And I'll talk about the sequel in a minute. Next up, we've got The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. And this is the classic Victorian novella, the Gothic novella. Interesting to read, very moody, very atmospheric. I did enjoy this one. However, I think my enjoyment was limited somewhat because the essential twist is not really a surprise to anyone these days, i.e., what is the identity of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? What is the mystery there? It's not really a mystery because it's so much a part of our pop culture. I think this novel would have been much more shocking and impactful back in the day when it was released. I'm going to give it 3 stars. And then I read another classic 19th century novel, Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Not really science fiction. This is more of an adventure novel. I did really enjoy this one, though. It's very entertaining, quite humorously written. I think this is a good showcase for Verne's humour. And fast-paced, exciting, entertaining. I think this is a Victorian novel which stands the test of time very well. It's not my favourite Verne. That would probably be 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But I'm going to give this 4 stars. Elysium Fire by Alistair Reynolds. So this was a reread for me. This is the sequel to Aurora Rising, aka The Prefect, one of my all-time favourite novels. Kind of police procedural space opera. I don't think it's quite as good as the predecessor, but it's still very entertaining, still very well written, and worthy of 4 stars. I'm going to put it after Jules Verne here. Next up, Children of Ruin by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is the sequel to Children of Time, another of my all-time favourites. I did enjoy this one, but nowhere near as much as Children of Time. So I did feel like it was kind of recycling some of the evolutionary world-building ideas that were introduced in Children of Time, and the uplifted octopuses, which are the focus of this novel, I didn't find as interesting as the spiders in Children of Time. And there weren't any characters which really captured my attention in this novel. It felt like a bit of a drag sometimes to read, but it did have some amazing sci-fi horror elements. I would give this maybe a score of 3.5 stars. I'm going to put it ahead of Jekyll and Hyde. Machine Vendetta. I mentioned I reread Elysium Fire. The reason I reread that is because I was preparing myself for the release of the 3rd book in this series, Prefect Dreyfus Emergency series. Machine Vendetta is the 3rd book. It came out in 2024, this year. So, yeah, and I thought this was a step up from Elysium Fire. For me, this book captured all of the charm and the magic of The Prefect. Excellent world building, an exciting plot with plenty of intrigue and suspense, believable characters, and fascinating SF ideas. All of these combined to make a truly compelling story, and one of my highlights of 2024. This is going at the top of the 5-star band. Possibly my top read of 2024. We'll see. Next up, we're taking a bit of a departure from science fiction. This is a non-fiction book. How They Broke Britain by James O'Brien. So for those who don't know, James O'Brien is a British journalist and radio host. And I think he's a very insightful political commentator. And in this book, he basically takes a critical examination of everything that's gone wrong in British politics over the last few years, and who is responsible and how it happened. And it's from a kind of left-wing perspective. I really enjoyed this. I think it's very well written, very insightful, and if you're at all interested in modern British politics, it's worth a read. I'm going to give it 4 stars. I'm going to put it after Alistair Reynolds. Okay, back to the sci-fi. Gateway by Frederick Pohl. This is perhaps my first disappointment of 2024. This is a kind of space opera with a very intriguing premise, but it was let down for me by an incredibly annoying and obnoxious protagonist, which limited my enjoyment of it quite a lot. So I'm going to put that in 2 stars, 2.5 stars. It's still a good read, but I couldn't get past the annoying, unlikable main character. Next up, Dark Matter by John Chapman. This is a self-published short story collection. John Chapman is the host of News from the Gelding, which is another BookTube channel, which I'm a big fan of. And it turns out he's not just a great booktuber, he's also a great writer, because I thoroughly enjoyed these stories. They're all kind of short sci-fi horror stories. Some of them are quite mind-bending, others are kind of more humorous, but they're all thoroughly entertaining and thought-provoking sometimes. So there wasn't a dud among them. I enjoyed this collection a lot, and I'm going to put it in the 4-star band here. Spin by Robert Charles Wilson is a very well-constructed novel. It's a Hugo Award winner with some epic sci-fi ideas and world building and complex characters. Everything comes together very nicely. It's a very well-constructed novel. For me, I'm going to give it 4 stars. The only reason I don't give it higher is I felt like it dragged on too long. So I'm going to put it at the bottom of the 4-star range. Children of Memory by Adrian Tchaikovsky is the 3rd book in the Children of Time trilogy. And this one I enjoyed more than Children of Ruin. I thought the ideas in this novel were quite fascinating. It's a little bit of a confusing book to read at first. It's not entirely clear what's going on, but everything does get explained. It's got quite an interesting twist. So I thought it was doing something new, which in a more interesting way than Children of Ruin. That's a 4-star book for me, and I'm going to put it just behind Alistair Reynolds. Okay, we've got some more non-fiction here. And this is The Bible, the Biography by Karen Armstrong. So we're going into religion here. Now, one of my interests is religion in general, history of religion, sociology of religion, philosophy of religion, comparative religion. All of these things fascinate me, although I'm not actually a believer myself. But I do think it's a fascinating area of study. And I've read a few of Karen Armstrong's books before, perhaps her best known work being The History of God. This particular book, I wanted to learn more about the Bible and its history, and I did, but I didn't really learn much new in here. It's quite a short book. It's nothing groundbreaking. I'm going to give it 3 stars. I'm going to put it after Jekyll and Hyde. Okay, and we go back to Alan Stroud with Resilient, which is the sequel to Fearless. So this is part of a series called the Fractal series. And as I mentioned with Fearless ends on a very abrupt note. The action takes off immediately in this book, Resilient, and it stays true to form with this kind of intense real-time narration, switching between characters. In this case, we've got a terrorist attack taking place on a space station outside Mars. It's pretty gripping. I'm going to give it 4 stars. It didn't feel quite as fresh as the first book, but it's still very entertaining. I'm going to put it here. Sacred Cows. Okay, this is another non-fiction book about religion. A light-hearted look at belief and tradition around the world. So Seth Andrews is a very interesting writer. I listened to this via audiobook. So I follow Seth Andrews via his the Thinking Atheist podcast and YouTube channel. So he's an atheist writer and activist. But he wasn't always an atheist. He was actually previously a Christian radio host, an evangelical. So he totally turned things around and became an atheist. So he's quite an interesting person. He's very articulate. He's very witty and humorous. And I chose to listen to this via audiobook because he's got a very smooth and comforting voice. This is quite a light-hearted read. It highlights some of the absurdities that you can find in religion around the world. Nothing groundbreaking in here. I would say it's a 3.5-star read, perhaps. I'm going to put it above Jekyll and Hyde. Next up we have The Wind's 12 Quarters, which is a short story collection by Ursula K. Le Guin, one of my favourite SF writers. So I don't think, from my experience, that I enjoy her short stories as much as her novels. This was a bit of a mixed bag of short stories. There's quite a lot of fantasy in here as well as sci-fi. It does include The Ones Who Walk Away from Umalas, which is one of my all-time favourite short stories and an absolute classic of philosophical short fiction. So it's worth reading just for that. But some of the other stories didn't really leave a strong impression on me. I'm going to give it 3 stars though, and I'm going to put it above The Bible, the biography. Next up we have 2001 A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke, which is an absolute classic. I'm a big fan of the Stanley Kubrick film, but I only read this novel for the first time this year, and I think this novel is quite beautifully written. It's very immersive, and it goes to some places where the film doesn't. It kind of explains things a little bit better than the film does, where things are left ambiguous. So overall, I found it a very satisfying read. I think when I reviewed it, I gave it 4.5 stars. I'm almost tempted to put it in the 5-star band. Yeah, let's round it up to a 5-star. I'm going to put it at the bottom of the 5 stars. Okay. Jump Noughts by Hao Jingfang. This is a new release for 2024. Chinese science fiction writer. This is a kind of space opera. A little bit of a strange one, this. It was an entertaining novel, but quite hard to engage with because the characters weren't at all believable. But it was an entertaining read. 3.5 stars for me. I'm going to put it actually a high 3-star above Children of Ruin. Inverted World by Christopher Priest. Now, this was a mind bender of a novel. I really enjoyed this. It's very intriguing mystery wrapped around some fascinating world building. I read this as a buddy read with Bart from Bart's Book Space, and we both had a lot of fun, I think, trying to unravel the mystery and understand what's going on while reading this. Again, this is one which I gave 4.5 stars, I think, when I reviewed it, and I'm going to round it up to 5 stars, and I'm going to put it just behind 2001. Next up we have Europa by Alan Stroud. This is a novella set within the Fractal series, i.e. the books Fearless and Resilient, which I've already mentioned here. So alongside the mainline Fractal trilogy, Alan Stroud released a plethora of these standalone novellas, which are set within the same world but feature different characters. And this story is a kind of murder mystery, if I remember correctly. Unfortunately, my reading experience wasn't that great because I was reading this novella on my phone. It's only available as an ebook. So I read it on my phone, which I think was a really bad reading experience. I should read it on a proper e-reader or on my laptop. I don't like reading on my phone. So I didn't enjoy it as much as the mainline series either. But it's still quite a good murder mystery in space. So I'm going to put that 3 stars. I'm going to put it here. Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein is an absolute classic, of course. I felt compelled to finally read this book. Despite some negative experience with Heinlein recently, I did enjoy this more than the previous book I read by him. I did like the concept. I liked the characters to some extent. And I thought there's some good humour in this book. However, it's way too long. It just drags on, this book. And Heinlein, of course, has a habit of injecting a lot of his views on politics and religion and things like this into the novel. That kind of put me off a little bit. I'm going to put this in 3 stars, but towards the bottom of 3 stars. I'm glad I read it though. Foundation by Asimov is, of course, another absolute classic, one of the most famous science fiction novels ever. I was a little bit underwhelmed by it, although it does contain some fascinating ideas and world building. It does feel very dated, and it didn't blow me away, but it's still pretty entertaining. I'm going to say that's a 3.5 star read. I'm going to put it towards the top of 3 stars. Life After Life by Kate Atkinson is perhaps the most disappointing book that I've read this year. This is more of a literary fiction novel than science fiction, although the premise itself, it sounds kind of sci-fi. It's a kind of time loop, lifelong time loop, in which we've got this woman who is born in the early 20th century, lives out her life, dies, and then is reborn to the same circumstances, and then this happens again and again and again. So she keeps on living out her life again and again. And of course, this is similar to other books like The First 15 Lives of Harry August, which is one of my all-time favourites. Or Replay by Ken Grimwood, which is another amazing novel. So I do like this kind of trope, and that's what attracted me to this book. But the problem is, this idea is not used very effectively in this novel. This is basically just historical fiction. There's a lot of slice of life in here, and I just was disappointed. It's not very interesting. It's well written, for sure, but it's just not what I was looking for, and it's not what I was expecting in this novel. So for that reason, I'm going to put it under 1 star. Next up, Remnant Population by Elizabeth Moon. Now, I thoroughly enjoyed this novel. This is a first contact novel in which we've got an unusual protagonist, an elderly lady who gets left behind on a colony planet, and she lives by herself in this world, thinking she's all by herself, but then she finds another sentient, intelligent species, and it's really entertaining, very well written, great characterization, and interesting alien species. I'm going to give it 4 stars, but 4.5 stars. I'm going to put it at the top of 4 stars. Followed by another amazing novel, Kazuo Ishiguro, Clara and the Sun, another buddy read. I read with Bart again from Bart's Bookspace, and Jonathan from Words of Time. This was a blast to read. This is a story about an AI friend, an artificial intelligence, and it's incredibly poignant, very well written, kind of heartwarming, I would say. I really enjoyed this book, and I'm going to say this is going to be like a 4.5 star read. I'm going to put it just below Remnant Population. Manhattan in Reverse by Peter F. Hamilton is a short story collection, and a very strong short story collection. There are a couple of amazing novellas in here. We've got a murder mystery which spans hundreds of years. This is my first taste of this author. I will be digging into some of his longer work next year, I think. But this was a very promising start. And I'm going to give this one 4 stars. I'm going to put it... Where am I going to put it? I'm going to put it just above Children of Memory. Yeah. Okay. Next up we have Bats Out of Hell by Guy N. Smith. This is a pulp sci-fi horror novel from the 70s, which was surprisingly good. And of major interest to me because it's set in my hometown of Birmingham, and it concerns an outbreak of a killer virus, a new form of meningitis which is spread via bats to humans, and which causes instant agony and death to whoever receives it. Okay, and it's written in a very interesting way. It's narrated from the point of view of a professor who is desperately trying to solve this crisis. But this story, this frame narrative, is intertwined with various vignettes as all hell breaks loose and the apocalypse unfolds, and it's just really entertainingly done. So I gave it 3.5 stars at the time. I think it's perhaps worthy of 4 stars. So I'm going to put it in here. I'm going to put it just behind Jules Verne. The next book is Daniel Dennett, another non-fiction book. In this case, it's an autobiography. I've Been Thinking. Now, Daniel Dennett was an American philosopher. I first learned about him through my interest in religion, because he wrote a book about the philosophy of religion called Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon, which I thought was a great read. But he's probably best known for philosophy of mind and free will, things like that. He passed away quite recently, so I wanted to learn more about his life, so I read his autobiography. It's quite interesting, but there's nothing groundbreaking in here. He had a long and quite privileged life. This is probably a 3 or 3.5 star read. I'm going to put it, let me see, I'm going to put it just below Children of Ruin. And then we have Vigilance by Alan Stroud, which is the 3rd book in the Fractal trilogy, following Fearless and Resilient. Again, it follows the same kind of style, this intense real-time narration with multiple point of view characters. Nothing need to add here. I did enjoy it, but again, it didn't feel as fresh as Fearless, and I don't think it's quite as well written as Fearless. I'm going to put it at the bottom. Well, I gave it 3.5 stars, I think, when I reviewed it. It's pretty good. I'm going to put it at 3 stars. I'm going to put it up here, let's say under Jump Knots. Service Model by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is another new release for 2024. I really enjoyed this book. It's a kind of post-apocalyptic novel set in a world in which humanity has all but died out, and most of the characters in this story are robots that have been left behind, and it's very humorously written, and I really enjoyed this. And for me, that's a 4.5 star read. I'm going to put it just above Around the World in 80 Days. And then we've got Them Bones by Howard Waldrop, which is a time travel novel, an alternate history novel, humorously written. Very underrated, this book, I think. And it was a blast to read, and I think it's worthy of 4 stars. I'm going to put it here. Meru by S.B. Divya is a very imaginative and thought-provoking space opera set several hundred years in the future, in which humanity exists alongside a new post-human species known as the Alloys. I interviewed the author earlier this year. I think it's a fascinating concept. I think this is a 4-star read for me, and I'm going to put it just above Children of Memory. I then read David Gerald, The Man Who Folded Himself, which is a truly mind-bending time travel story. This was an interesting one. I did enjoy it, but I think the story suffered a little bit from lack of characters. It's a 3.5 star read for me, and I'm going to put it above Vigilance. Loka by S.B. Divya is the sequel to Meru, which I just mentioned, and this book is I really enjoyed it. I think I enjoyed it a little bit more than Meru. It's a kind of coming of age story. Another new release that came out earlier this year. I'm going to put this one here. Okay, and now we've got another a return to Seth Andrews and his book Christianity Made Me Talk Like an Idiot, which was a very humorous book. Again, I listened to it via audiobook, which I think is definitely the way to go with Seth Andrews. As I mentioned, he was a former evangelical who eventually became an atheist, and so he talks a lot about in this book about his some of his crazy ideas, or some of the crazy things from evangelical Christianity. Very humorously written, and although this has got nothing to do with science fiction, I did make a note of an Asimov quote which I learnt from this book, so I'm going to read it. Properly read, the Bible is the most potent force for atheism ever conceived. That is a quote from Isaac Asimov. Worth remembering that one. This was very entertaining, more so than Sacred Cows. I'm going to give it 4 stars, and I'm going to put it around about here, just behind Dark Matter. And then I read Up the Line by Robert Silverberg, a time travel novel, and one of the best time travel novels I've ever read. Thoroughly entertaining, very tongue-in-cheek in tone, and this is a novel about a time courier. This is a man who escorts tour groups to the past, and it's very well done, very entertaining, quite humorous. In fact, this was one of my top reads of the year. I gave it 5 stars when I reviewed it, and I think it's still worth 5 stars. I'm going to put it just behind Machine Vendetta. Next up, Howard Who by Howard Waldrop. So, I've already mentioned Howard Waldrop. He's best known for his short stories, and this is a short story collection. Unfortunately, it didn't quite hit the mark for me. These stories they're quite zany. They've got some interesting ideas, some interesting humor, but none of them really were that compelling for me. There were no fascinating sci-fi ideas, so it was, I think, a 2.5 star read. I'm going to put it here above Gateway. Contingency Plans for the Apocalypse and Other Possible Situations is another short story collection that I read. This one is by S.B. Divya, who wrote Meru and Loka, and this was a standout collection, probably the best short story collection I've read this year. I enjoyed every single story. Some of them I absolutely loved, and this includes the novella runtime, which was amazing. So I gave this 4.5 stars when I reviewed it, and I'm going to round it up to 5 stars. I'm going to put it up here, just in front of Inverted World. This was followed by The Time Migration, a book which I picked up in China. This is another short story collection. It's by Liu Cixin, who wrote The Three-Body Problem. Bit of a mixed bag. There are some decent stories in here, but nothing to write home about. But it was pretty entertaining for what it is. I think it's worth 3.5 stars, and I'm going to put it at the upper end of 3 stars. And then we have The Doors of His Face, The Lamps of His Mouth, and Other Stories by Roger Zelazny. Roger Zelazny, a very accomplished writer. There are some amazing stories in here. This is a really solid collection. But I didn't love every story. There were some which didn't really leave much of an impression on me. It's a 4-star read overall, though, and I'm going to put it just behind Them Bones. I Am I was a very short novelette or novella by Ai Jiang, which I read as a palate cleanser. I did quite enjoy this one, but I don't remember much about it. It was just too short. I think that's a 3 or 3.5 star read for me. I'm going to put it just behind Children of Ruin. And then we go on to Colin Wilson and the Spiderworld series. Spiderworld The Tower is an amazing and underrated novel, I think. It's a kind of adventure story set in a future post-apocalyptic Earth in which spiders have become the dominant race of the world and have subjugated humanity. I gave this book 5 stars, and I think it's absolutely worthy of 5 stars. I'm going to put it just behind Up the Line. Right. So the next book is Bob Shaw, Other Days, Other Eyes. Bob Shaw comes up with some of the best ideas in science fiction, I think, and this is no exception. He came up with a very intriguing invention, slow glass which slows down light. And with this novel, he kind of constructs an SF crime story around this. It was an interesting idea, but I didn't really engage much with the characters, the plot. It wasn't particularly memorable for me. I would say it's a 3.5-star read. I'm going to put it at the top of 3 stars. Sinophagia, edited by Xueting Ni. So this is the follow-up to the anthology Synopticon, which is a collection of modern Chinese SF, which I've talked about on this channel before. In this case, we're following up science fiction with horror. So these are all Chinese horror stories, and it's a very solid collection. There are some excellent stories in here. I really enjoyed this. This was a new release for 2024, and I'm going to put it in the 4-star band, and I'm going to put it just behind Meru. Spiderworld The Delta. This is the sequel to The Tower. It's the second book in the Spiderworld series. Again, a compelling adventure with fascinating ideas and world building. I would say this is a 4.5-star read, and I'm going to put it at the top end of 4 stars. The only reason I don't give it 5 stars is it lacks the same freshness as in the first book. The next book is The Death of Grass by John Christopher, which is a very atmospheric, bleak, post-apocalyptic novel which imagines what might happen if all species of grass were to die, and the chaos that ensues and the rise of barbarism. Very well written, an engaging read. I'm going to put it in the 4-star category. Where does it go though? Let's say let's put it above Bats Out of Hell. Spiderworld the Magician, the 3rd book in the Spiderworld series, was a bit of a step down, I think, in this series. There is a less tight narrative, is less adventure. It felt... There are a few issues with this book. It's still entertaining, but it's a 3-star read. I'm going to put it just above Jekyll and Hyde. And then we have Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, an absolute classic, of course. You don't get more classic than this. I did think about reviewing this book. This was a reread for me, but in the end, I thought I just couldn't do it. I mean, what can I say about Frankenstein that hasn't already been said? It is beautifully written. It is the ultimate science fiction novel, still worth reading today after over 200 years. And I'm so glad I reread it this year. I'm going to put it in the 5-star band. This is definitely 5 stars. I think it deserves to be at the top, at number 1 for now. So, overtaken Alistair Reynolds. Next up we have The Lovers by Philip Jose Farmer. One of Philip Jose Farmer's first stories. It was actually his first published story in its original novella form. I really enjoyed this more than I was expecting, actually. It's a very intriguing piece of literature with some fascinating ideas and a pretty mind-boggling twist and some pretty intriguing xenobiology. 4 stars. I'm going to put it I'm going to put it next to The Death of Grass. Spiderworld Shadowland. This is the 4th and final book in the Spiderworld series. A step up, I think, from book 3. Very well written, but with more fantastical elements than previous books. And sometimes the plot dragged and was frankly boring in parts. So it's definitely a flawed novel, but I'm glad I read it. and I think it does bring the series to a close quite nicely. Overall, it was a good read. 3.5 stars. I'm going to put it. I'm going to put it just behind Foundation. Night of the Crabs is another pulp horror novel by Guy N. Smith about killer crabs emerging from the waters off the coast of Wales. Quite entertaining, but very, I would say, not very well written, very trashy, and nowhere near as good as Bats Out of Hell. So I think I gave this one 2.5 stars. But it's still quite entertaining. So I'm going to be generous. I'm going to round this one up. I'm going to put it in a 3-star band, albeit at the bottom. This was followed by Ubik by Philip K. Dick, a book which I've been putting off for far too long. And what a ride this novel was. This is an absolute mind bender of a novel, perfectly constructed, perfectly paced, fascinating ideas, fascinating technology. I loved everything about this book. This is a definite 5-star read. The only question is, where does it go in the ranking? You know what? I'm actually going to put this ahead of Frankenstein. I think I enjoyed this more than Frankenstein. So this currently takes the number 1 spot. Dangerous Visions, the classic anthology edited by Harlan Ellison. I was very disappointed with this. There's a lot of big names in here. Unfortunately, not many of these stories hit the mark for me. I don't know what it is, but because there are a lot of great authors in this collection, but I can only really think of one story which I can definitively say I really liked, and that was the Philip K. Dick story. I think it's called Faith of Our Fathers. The others were either forgettable or not very good or okay, but none of them really were worth the price of admission, except for the Philip K. Dick story. So for this reason, I'm going to have to put it in the 1-star band. Unfortunately, The Grand Adventure by Philip Jose Farmer. It's a short story collection, the last short story collection or anthology in this list. I quite enjoyed this one. There are some interesting stories. It's a bit of a mixed bag, as is often the case with these collections. But there was one story in particular which was pretty mind-bending, and I can't remember what it's called now. I'll have to put a subtitle at the bottom of the screen. But there's one story which is absolutely worth looking for in this volume. So I'm going to give this one 4 stars, but I'm going to put it down here. Elder Race by Agent Tchaikovsky is a perfect blend of fantasy and sci-fi. Some really interesting ideas going on in this short novel / novella. I really enjoyed Agent Tchaikovsky's writing style in this one. This is a 4-star read, I think, for me. I think I'm going to put it around about here. And we're down to the last book, which is Binti by Nnedi Okorafor, which is a very short novella. It's only 90 pages long, and I chose to read this so I could squeeze it in as a final read for this year. And I really enjoyed it, actually. It's a very interesting coming-of-age story, and some interesting aliens. I would be tempted to continue the Binti series, Where should I put it though? I think I didn't quite enjoy it as much as Elder Race, so I'm just going to put behind Elder Race. Okay, and there we have it. Those are all the books that I read this year. As you can see, Ubik made it to number 1. I think it thoroughly deserves that position. But yeah, I've had an amazing year. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.